Actually, I hope you talk about Donald Trump, because we're here basically to try to answer questions for you, but we will provide a, excuse me, a brief introduction. A lot of what's been going on, of course, has to do with being outside the borders, I guess, with regard to what we think about the press in American democracy. I wanted to go over just a little bit, and I'm only going to take about 10 minutes, and Dan will probably take about 10 minutes as well, and open it up to the floor for questions. But when we talk about Trump and the media, so it's not just Trump and the presidency we're talking about, it's Trump and the media specifically. A lot of the discord, a lot of the unhappiness, a lot of what people are talking about has to do with the way he treats the media. I'm also going to make a point here, I'll say it again later on, it's not only how he treats the media, it's how the media treats him. And that leads to a conclusion that I'm going to come to here in terms of a point later on. But with regard to the press, the media, and I'll use the press interchangeably with the media, we know that the media is much more than, excuse me, the press is it's much more than the press. We're talking about all kinds of media, whether it's electronic media, whether it's social media, whether it's print media, whether it's television, streaming news, you name it. All those things are included when I use the term press or the media, so we make that clear at the beginning. Freedom of the press is a basic national commitment. The idea that the press is supposed to have the opportunity to do all the things that the Founding Fathers wanted to do is something embodied, enshrined basically in the First Amendment to the Constitution. I put this up here basically as a reminder. Most of you, I think, understand what's in the First Amendment, the implications of the First Amendment, but freedom of the press is enshrined in that First Amendment. It's important to understand that Donald Trump is not going to run it off. Congress is not going to run it off. You're not going to run it off. It's a part of the Constitution of our country. So Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for redress of grievances. Embodying that first sentence to a great degree is, and if you don't know, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are basically amendments directed at government. They're not at individual citizens. And of course, our founding fathers just came out of basically a set of circumstances where government was overpowering, and they wanted to basically make sure that whatever they created would not be the same kind of overpowering government. So no prior restraint by government, and that was probably basically reinforced again in terms of judgment for the New York Times during the Vietnam War era. No prior restraint, meaning government cannot stop basically the press from doing what it's supposed to do in terms of its functions and responsibilities. So basically, whatever Donald Trump thinks, whatever Congress thinks, whatever, the press has that right basically not to be opposed upon by government. That doesn't hold true necessarily for student publications and student press and Tiger Media Network and a variety of other folks, but we can talk about that if you'd like it at some point in time. So no prior restraint by government. These are the most important points. There are other things in there. And then keeping the government and politicians honest and accountable, which we call the watchdog function of government. A lot of folks get mad at the press because they don't say positive things. They basically do not focus on things that would make people happy. But that's part of their responsibility to hold politicians and government accountable. And most of that has a focus on negativity to a great extent. Because when politicians break the law or when government does things it's not supposed to do, you're probably going to get a negative story. You're not going to get a positive story. Certainly the Founding Fathers never intended the media, the press, to be a publicity arm or to be a marketing arm or a branding arm for the government of the United States or for state and local politicians or anybody else. It was designed basically to hold them accountable so they would do the things that they were supposed to do given the rule of law in this country. So again, some of that gets lost in the Trump churn, so to speak. So when Donald Trump has got him churning, so to speak, in terms of not only the press, but also citizens and other folks, this whole idea of holding politicians accountable kind of gets lost in the process. So in the beginning and then evolutionary in nature. That first function I mentioned to you just a moment ago, the watchdog function, there's also the common carrier function, politicians to people, meaning the press is used as a tool basically to bring information and an information flow on a regular basis to the people. Information is important in terms of people getting educated with regard to what politicians are doing, what policies are being proposed. So that common carrier function has always been a part of what the founding fathers intended to be a flow of information. Back then it was pamphlets, in terms of Thomas Paine and a variety of other things. Dan may tell you a little bit about that as well. The information or signaling function, this is when events break, hurricanes occur, when a whole variety of things happen, when we're investigating Russia and other such things. That's basically the signaling function, and it tends to set the agenda. That's another thing that the press does. And Donald Trump uses it pretty well to set the agenda at this point in time. I give him credit for that. But that signaling function brings something happening out here, an event, a development, a trend, to the people so they understand what's going on and can make better decisions and tell their politicians what's happening. The partisan function was always a part of that First Amendment statement. And that's what basically the founding fathers thought would happen at the beginning, that basically the press would be a part of, the newspapers especially would be a part of political parties. They didn't want political parties to begin with, but the press is very much associated with political parties at the beginning in 1789 in terms of the founding fathers' intention. That partisan function, taking sides, has changed a great deal. Instead of a broadcast partisan function, what do I mean by a broadcast partisan function? They would take the side of a particular political party and go back before the Civil War to really get where that begins to evolve in a different direction. But today, talks and blogs is just two examples, equal bias on steroids. The press is always charged with bias, whether it's liberal bias or something else. But today, in terms of the evolution of social media especially, they specialize in being biased. And again, blogs, radio talk, whatever, but it's right up there, basically radio talk when I say talks. Those things all have to do with a partisan function that the press is performing. So they do have a partisan function to perform, and it was intended that they would do that, and we can talk more about that later if you'd like. So the evolution to the objective model. Everybody says, well, the media should be neutral, right? Should be fair. That's not necessarily correct in terms of the inception of the press, the inception of the First Amendment. They were expected to have some bias to some degree. I just set it up above here when we talk about the partisan function. But somewhere in the 19th century, we began evolving to this model, this new model, where the press was basically, to a great degree, it has to do with corporations and economic capitalism and a number of other things. They gravitated, they migrated toward a model basically that would appeal to more people. So obviously they could be more successful. If you're partisan, we're talking about identity politics here to some extent. You're with small groups, you're with one particular group. If you're objective and fair, supposedly, in theory, you're appealing to everybody. And as a result of appealing to everybody, hopefully you've got better support, and you'll sell more papers or you'll sell more information or whatever it is that you're trying to sell. Generally speaking, when we come into the present, we're talking about a lot of shrinkage and fragmentation, and technology has been the driver for that. What do I mean by shrinkage and fragmentation? There used to be a much larger media press out there in terms of conventional or traditional media. Today, I think we've lost about 250 newspapers in this country in the last decade. That's the kind of shrinkage I'm talking about. A lot of them are disappearing, and some of them basically will never come back, especially if you're sitting in Hays, Kansas, or Leone or someplace out west. A lot of those small county newspapers and others are gone. They're not in the 250 that I'm talking about. The 250 are large national newspapers that have left us. So there's a lot of shrinkage going on in the media right now. And then the fragmentation is basically, if you're a newspaper today, you've got to be involved in electronic media in a whole variety of different ways. You can't just put out print media. You've got to own, Amazon owns the Washington Post. I mean, we're talking about a lot of fragmentation in terms of who owns what, when, and when they got it. Those things basically are changing the media, and the media is trying to deal with it. Let me move ahead, and then I'm going to stop here in a second. What did I do with that? Oops. Okay, so the rest of my commentary is premised by this quotation that I have from the October 2017 issue of the Atlantic. So I'm going to talk about Trump in very favorable terms. I'm going to talk about the media in favorable terms, but much of this has to do with the feelings a lot of people have, and myself, with regard to where we are. We have never had a president so ill-informed about the nature of his office. so openly mendacious, so self-destructive, or so brazen in his abusive attacks on the courts, the press, Congress, including members of his own party, and even senior officials within his own administration. And this is particularly interesting. Trump is a Frankenstein's monster of past presidents' worst attributes. Andrew Jackson's rage, Millard Fillmore's bigotry, James Buchanan's incompetence and spite, Theodore Roosevelt's self-aggrandizement, Richard Nixon's paranoia, insecurity, and indifference to the law, and Bill Clinton's lack of self-control and reflexive dishonesty. I read that even though I know you can read, because I want to be somewhat provocative and have you think about this as we talk about Trump in the media and where we go from there. I'll let you take over.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. When Dr. Gould mentioned this topic to me, it was interesting for me that a phrase that came to my mind was the cluttered atmosphere of information and how it impacts our behavior. So I'd like you to think about, how do you often receive your information? How do you get your information? And especially, how do you organize the information that you receive? Because we can look at history for different moments when we are impacted by new methods of receiving information. And that would actually make for an interesting course, I think. These different timelines, or these different moments in history where something is happening either technologically or some kind of change emerges and it does something to information. So we are in a library, and I sometimes consider librarians to be in the business of information, and especially organizing information, right? Think about early ideas of a library and what they looked like. Were they instantly organizing information as they got it? When I look at some of the early ways in which libraries were constructed, sometimes they would just pile things in based on what came in each year. Then the idea of creating categories and organizing information eventually comes in as a way to try to retrieve information. So we have these different moments in history where we have sanctioned people who deliver information. So you think about a pre-literate society. How did you get information that you could rely upon? One example would be Viking culture. I'll just use this as an example. Prior to being a literate culture, Viking citizens could go to an event called an Althing. And at that Althing, you would have what we call a poet or a sculpt who memorized all of the laws. And you could listen to the person recite all of the laws, and if you had a claim based on those laws, you could take somebody to court. It's interesting, in Viking culture, women had the right to divorce their husbands and get their land. They had far more equal rights than women after that, until some time. So what do we do with information? And I kept thinking about this kind of cluttered atmosphere of information that we currently live in. And I was thinking of different times in history where information and political disruption went together. So you think about the printing press and the impact of the printing press. I don't know how many of you know about English history, but there was a King Charles who was executed. And I would suggest that if it weren't for the printing press and the pamphlet wars, King Charles probably would not have been executed. Because what you get in England in the 1600s are these mass productions of pamphlets. And this belief in freedom of the press and an increasing belief in freedom of speech. So this might sound odd. The English Puritans were different than the American Puritans. The English Puritans believed in freedom of the press. So even if someone is going to produce something that was atheistic, they said, don't censor that document. Allow it to be printed, because if you don't allow it to be printed, what happens to people if you censor items? So they believe completely in freedom of the press, but that freedom of the press created these pamphlet wars. So people were mass producing pamphlets, sometimes, well, probably many times, with misinformation being produced and spread around. Does that sound familiar for our own kind of life that we live in today and the type of information that we receive? So there's this problem of trying to find an authorized text, which comes in later, which is often related to capitalism. You get the invention of magazines, more and more newspapers that become credible sources, and that helps to regulate information so that you can find the true source of information rather than just throwing things out. It's rather similar to our own current time. And so the other thing that I was thinking about in terms of Trump and the media is a book that's been greatly influenced. I've been greatly influenced by a book by Pierre Bourdieu called Language and Symbolic Power, which works, I think, really rather well for what we're talking about during our time. Symbolic power is basically the power that a person has that a culture invests in that person. Trump doesn't really have power except for the power that we permit him to have. Any leader doesn't really have any power except for the power that we permit that leader to have. And so I think about our cultural moment and how that has produced what we have in terms of a president. Not so much that Trump has done anything, but our cultural moment. And so how does he represent our cultural moment? And in many ways, the ideas that Dr. Gould has underscored help to demonstrate how Trump and the media represents our cultural moment. So, flipping through Facebook as an example. Since I've traveled internationally, I have friends from mostly other countries in Southeast Asia. So I have friends in Taiwan, Malaysia, Bangladesh. Bangladeshis use Facebook everywhere. Everybody's connected to Facebook in Bangladesh. So I have about 500 or so friends from Bangladesh in my Facebook account. So you think about what happens when you scroll through Facebook. What's going on now in Bangladesh in terms of refugees? Some of you know. Horrible things. Up to 500, 700,000 refugees pouring into Bangladesh. Muslims who were being mistreated and seeking shelter in Bangladesh. So I can get on my Facebook page images of refugees living under horrible conditions, and then what could be the next thing underneath that? Somebody's happy puppy, right? Or my cousin who's a Trump supporter feeding out information about why Trump is a great president. My brother who's angry at Trump feeding out information about why he's angry at Trump. Underneath that, goats in pajamas, right? So what kind of information environment or atmosphere do we live in? It's this cluttered world that we live in. And so we're at this moment where we're trying to find a way to organize the material to make sense, because we breathe that clutter. It informs our own behavior. And so that's what I find fascinating about Trump and the media. How much is he a product of what we live in? And it doesn't surprise me as well that on the government's agenda is trying to get more businesses to do something with this information, as if to be able to create, I guess, platforms that we can trust, platforms that we can rely upon. Because we're at a moment now where there is such a huge clutter of all of this information, and it's caused this disruption. And for me, I see it being similar to other disruptions, in the past. I had mentioned King Charles. He was executed in 1649. The Battle of Edgehill kind of marks the beginning of the English Civil War. And what's interesting about the Battle of Edgehill is that 24 hours after that battle, a pamphlet was produced about what happened at that battle. That pamphlet had misinformation. It was mildly corrected in another 24 hours, and it wasn't until 5 days later that the official kind of authorized text about what happened at the Battle of Edge Hill happened. There's interesting moments in our own history in terms of what we do with information, how do we find reliable information, and what we can trust. And I really see Trump and the media as being all part of that kind of historical series of events that have happened in the past.
So, Times Talk are supposed to be based upon an article from the New York Times, which is why we encourage you to get the subscription, which is free through the library. Not a paid public announcement, it's a free one for the library. But basically, this is the article that I looked at for a variety of different things and drew some of these points out of. So if you want to go back there and take a look at it, the best way to do Times Talk is to have you have this article beforehand. Well, we didn't do that. So back to the present. We've given you historical context. We've given you some conceptual ideas with regard to cluttered information. So when it comes to the talking points that they've put together, we put together for you to be involved. Let me just go over this real quickly and then open the floor for discussion. Press and the president. Again, the press means media, social media, whatever kind of media you want to talk about. I've characterized it as a mutually beneficial relationship of competition, tension, insecurity, and dependence. I'm saying the media has these 4 variables on its side, and Trump has those 4 variables on his side. When it comes to competition, historically, and we've given you some historical context, basically there's always been this dependence, this competition, I should say, between the press and the White House. It's nothing new. You're looking at it, but it's not new. When it comes to tension, that tension's been there as a result of the First Amendment to the Constitution. Basically, people can say what they need to say, and Trump can say what he needs to say when it comes to Trump and the media. Insecurity on the part of the media? Yeah, fragmentation and shrinkage. I talked about that earlier in the previous slide. The media is trying to figure out where it's going in life, what it's doing at this particular point in time, and that basically insecurity is also on Trump's side of the fence as well, because the guy says he's not a politician. We know he's a politician, but he really doesn't know what's happening in Washington, D.C. to a great extent. He's still trying to figure it out. And so that insecurity that he has from the 1970s and the 1980s, I'm saying to you, Trump basically was insecure long before he ever got to Washington. He needs all the attention he possibly can get. He's a narcissist and all that other good stuff. I'm not psychoanalyzing him. You can read the research in terms of Trump. He was the way he was before he ever got to Washington, D.C. So that insecurity is there on both sides. Whatever the media can do to drum up business, they will. Whatever Trump can do to drum up business, he will do. Dependence, they both depend upon one another. That's a mutually beneficial relationship. So they're both dependent upon one another, and they're running around in circles sometimes, and they're throwing rocks at each other and doing a whole variety of things, but that's Trump and the media. A couple of talking points on certainty across the media spectrum. The media is finding now that it was struggling to survive, but now it's thriving. I mean, things are really getting hot for the media. There's still the shrinkage and the fragmentation, but those that are surviving are making their way in the world much better since Donald Trump became president 7 months ago. So in some sense, the media likes what has happened because they're using the relationship basically to make themselves work. Trump delivers ratings, clicks, and revenue, loosens journalistic standards, and changes the terms of news coverage with Twitter. Goes around the media to some extent, but drums up business for the media because whatever he tweets in the morning, the media picks up and makes a story out of it, and you pay attention to it. You and the rest of the world pay attention to it to a great extent. Journalistic standards, we talk about the objective model, and we talk about being fair enough to forget it. Trump has loosened up those standards to a great extent, and the media is making use of what's going on with regard to his conversation with the rest of the world. And CNN shows the way in the ratings turnaround, thank the Don. I mean, CNN was up even way back in probably August or September, up 174% in terms of viewers. It's now up today, I think like 300%. MSNBC has surpassed Fox News. I mean, things are just going bonkers in terms of where the media was at one point in time. And then the New York Times, I mean, he's saved print media is what it comes down to. Newspapers, how many of you read newspapers? Yeah, but those people that read newspapers, and there are like 4 of you that put your hands up, are now reading more newspapers and reading the different kinds of newspapers, things that you haven't read in the past. the coverage for the New York Times and the Washington Post and the big guys basically has tripled in the last year or so. So again, thank to Don. Why not? Slamming the media is an act of love for Trump and appeals to the base. This is not new for Donald Trump. He lived in the New York media world, and he's been doing this for a long, long time. This is not new. However, to the extent he's carried his love is a little bit different than what it was before he came to Washington, D.C. So again, Trump is insecure, he needs attention, and the media gives him attention that he otherwise would not have. And so this is not a new thing. He's been doing it for about 40 years or so. At the same time, it does appeal to the base and gets people excited, those that voted for him. And slamming the media is something Americans like to do for a variety of reasons. They think there's supposed to be positive news, and the news never is positive. They think that their local politician or the state of Kansas or whatever it is subject to liberal bias and all kinds of good things. So again, this appeals to the base, to the people that voted for Trump, and he uses the media in that way. So I will stop there. I hope I provoked you to some extent to bring some of your own insight and your own questions forth, and we'll go from there. Anybody have a question?
So, you say that Trump, specifically, his end goal is to get people to say nice things about him. And so with recent deals with legislative Democrats, the media has done just that. MSNBC, Morning Joe, all of those shows have now been saying great things about Trump as a bipartisan maverick. So do you think the press now has the ability to make more bipartisan deals by continuing to say nice things about him when he does these things?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think so. I think the more things you say positive about him, the more likely he is to respond. He's not loyal. I don't think he's going to stick with the Democrats. If something goes wrong, he'll go in another direction. But I think the press can play him, and I think they are playing him to a great extent. Not all of them have a strategy, but it's kind of impulsive, just like Trump is impulsive. If something good happens and the ratings go up and the clicks start coming in, onward they go. So I think you've got a good point. Dan, did you have a...
I was thinking to a certain extent about Queen Elizabeth I, going back to that
Okay.
time period. And she's a female leader of England, and so many different political forces tried to control her. And what she did that was either part of her own insecurities or part of her astute leadership was to play each one off of each other. And she was sometimes criticized for being changeable. Of course, that would be because she's a woman, in part. She's changeable. We can't predict what she's going to do. What is she thinking? She says this, she does that. She plays off of each person, you know, and so again, I'm thinking about different times in history where you have leaders who have these unpredictable patterns, and does it work or doesn't it work, you know, for its time. And I think we sometimes see that with Trump. Some people enjoy that, some people are nervous about it, you know, so yeah.
Other questions?
You mentioned that you think the relationship between press and president is beneficial to those two parties, but do you think it's non-beneficial to everybody else?
That's a good point, too. Yeah, I'm not sure you're getting the best news in the world. I mean, you're getting a lot of drama. We all know that Trump is a reality TV star. He knows how to kind of play the press to some extent, but that doesn't mean play the press in terms of the partisan function or the signaling function or any of those other things, getting good information to the public. So I think you're right. I think to some extent we've got a distortion of information. We've got information that has less quality than it probably could have. But again, I would say that's not new. You know, it doesn't make it better because it's not new, but it's just not new. But to the extent, back to your clutter of information, it's probably more so than ever before, which is kind of sad in terms of engagement, civic engagement, and other kinds of things. We use the press to try to educate folks, and I think that's kind of the point that you're making. We're not getting the best education as a result of this give and take back and forth.
First, I want to thank you guys for coming and talking. It's good to hear another point of view. But I have a question about editorializing. I've noticed even in your guys' publications sometimes you'll refer to Barack Obama as President Obama, and then in the same next sentence say Mr. Trump. It's kind of the New York Times way of saying not my president. I'm wondering what you guys feel about that, and if I don't know if everybody notices stuff like that, but just kind of your thought on that.
Yeah, it's kind of like Rocket Man.
Yeah, exactly. It's just
He's
the
not
name.
the guy that leads North Korea.
Yeah.
He's Rocket Man. I mean, Donald Trump has made a living calling other people names, there's no doubt about that. So you're right, though, in terms of framing, I guess, the way people think about somebody by calling them Mr. Trump instead of President Obama or whatever. So I think that's pretty accurate. I'm not so sure that that's a strategy across the media, you know, in terms of the liberal bias claim, which I think is somewhat accurate, but at the same time, if you think there's a big conspiracy out there, I think it's more driven by economic capitalism than anything else. But that's another story and another tale. But I do think you're right. I think there's some validity in what you're saying.
I think in some ways, though, when I see some of the posts by Trump, you know, he kind of pats himself on the back for not conforming. They're trying to make me conform. They're trying to make me play this role, and I'm not going to play it. So there's a certain part of him himself that says, I'm not a president. I'm something different. You know, I'm something other. I am not inside politics. Nobody is going to make me play this part. And so I think about it as sort of a part of the cultural atmosphere, you know, itself. So yeah, there could be certain ways in which people linguistically make some of these choices, but I think he has a part that he also plays that contributes to it, at least in terms of what I see him saying, and even, you know, supporters. And again, these are supporters who are relatives of mine, and what they say about him in terms of, you know, different posts that I'll read will just say, you want him to be like so-and-so, but he's not, and that's why we voted for him. So there's this aspect of him that he is this other that we keep trying to define, you know, in itself. He doesn't stand up all the time to necessarily be presidential. You know, there are multiple aspects of him, you know.
Does it have to be a question?
No.
To right off that point, I was listening to an interview with prominent Black Lives Matter activist and former Detroit mayor candidate DeRay McKesson, and he was interviewing a few media participants, and they addressed that specifically, why they would never refer to Donald Trump as President Trump, and why they referred to everybody else as President, whomever they were. And she summed it up in a good line, and it was, I will claim him as my president when he claims me as one of his constituents. And it was along the lines of the policy that he wants to create and the message he brings does not include these specific kinds of people into his America. And so if they're not part of his America, he is not their president. And so I think that's also a general claim on why people refuse to call him President Trump.
Yeah. You've also pointed out an aspect of politics, and you were in my CPI class, so you know a little bit about the definition of politics and what we're doing. But Dan referred to symbolic politics to some extent, about the use of symbols. I mean, that goes on all the time in the political process in terms of people using symbols in various ways and using identity politics and changing the identity basically by calling them Mr. as opposed to President. But we know he does the same thing in the other direction, and maybe he's smart in doing it because it does appeal to his base. But symbolic politics is just a very, very common part of what we define as politics, whether it's private politics or public politics or whatever. Politicians use symbols and citizens use symbols in various ways to do the same thing in the other direction.
We all know.
Go ahead.
And we all know that President Trump is prevalent in using name calling as a political tactic. You know, fake Tier Schumer, calling Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas. It happens on both sides. He also engages in this kind of activity.
Right. To some degree, the reason why we're paying so much attention to it is what you said, I think, a few moments ago, too, and that is we don't expect our presidents to behave that way or to use those kinds of symbols or to use the kind of approach that Trump is using. I'm not saying that it's beyond the borders of what a president can do, but it's beyond the borders of what we expect a president to do, and that gap between the two has created a lot of the controversy and a lot of discussion, a lot of the noise that we've heard in various ways. Nathan?
I also do just want to establish real quick in regards to the content of the New York Times. I can't speak to their editorial opinion content at this time, but when it comes to their journalistic content, if you do see, say, Mr. Trump referred to in that way, that is actually following a journalistic standard where the first time the president is referred to within an article, they will be referred to as President blank, and then each successive time, they'll be referred to as Mr. blank. Again, I can't speak to editorial and opinion content, but within their journalistic content, within the articles, they do have an entire editorial board that is, checking these things. There is likely not going to be overtly politicized language. They are following standards, journalistic standards, in how they phrase these things. And I do just want to establish that.
Yeah, that's a good observation, and it goes back to some degree, irrespective of trying to go beyond and look out in the media and other places, in terms of the loosening of standards. Those standards are just not what they were even 7 months ago to a great extent. They're there, but I would suggest to you that in terms of the media fighting back, so to speak, some of those standards, as Nathan is talking about, have evolved. They may come back again, I think they will, when it comes to subsequent presidents of the United States. I think some of the behavior will be gone, but that's just an observation on my part. Sure.
So I think that we all are in agreement that there's that tension that you were talking about, but let's say long after President Trump boards the helicopter for the last time and long after Rachel Maddow has her last show or whoever, what do you think the long-lasting effect or legacy of this presidential administration in accordance with the media will be?
That's a
Good or bad?
That's a good question. I mean, you could write an article about that for a number of Tiger Media Network or whatever. I think it's going to be lasting for a while. As I said, I think the next president coming in, whether it's 2020 or 2024 or whatever it may be, will resort back to the more professional approach that we've seen. It depends on who it is, but I, generally speaking, would say that, given 44 other presidents. But I think that the media standards are going to be what they are today for a while. I think they've loosened up and they're going to stay there for some time. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I generally think it's a bad thing, but maybe not. And maybe more information, back to your question over there, gets to the people as a result of opening up this process. Maybe more people are being educated about the media and what the media, is supposed to be doing. That doesn't mean, back to Nathan's comment about journalistic standards, I think some of the things at the Columbia School of Journalism are going to change in terms of what's being taught. So I think there's an evolutionary process going on here, to answer your question directly, that may go in one direction, may go in another direction, and it may resort back to what it was. I can't tell you at this point in time because I don't know what the end is in 2020 or 2024, but I think there's definitely going to be some heavy-duty change in terms of what's going on. And hopefully the journalism community will reflect on itself and think about what it's doing and what it needs to do as we continue to enter the age of clutter, or live in the age of clutter.
I think if we look at history, it'll correct itself. Something new is going to emerge based on how we manage information, what we do with information, and how we process information to turn it into knowledge. So I think we'll go through a decade or so of this transition part. So I really see this as a transition period in terms of what's going on with information and how we deal with information. Otherwise, I fear that if it ends in a linear manner, then I don't know how many of you are familiar with the movie Idiocracy. I worry that that's where we're going to go. And do you know the name of the president from that movie? President Dwayne Elizondo Mountain Dew Herbert Camacho is his name. And it's all this commodified misinformation, right, that people live by. But I don't think that that's going to happen. I think we're in the process of correcting it, trying to do something with it. I was talking with Deb about changes to curriculum. How do we repackage information as part of what we are? We're in the knowledge economy, aren't we? We are in that kind of business of trying to process information into knowledge so that we can move forward and make life better. So I think for me it's an interesting moment because of what we are trying to do as humans. And I think it's also important, maybe the other discussion at some time in the future would be to look at Trump and the media and its impact globally. Because we're not always aware here of what other people, are doing and thinking internationally. I was greatly surprised to see how many people in Bangladesh, for example, just use Facebook as communication, or Malaysia using Facebook as communication, so that I'm communicating with them on a daily basis through that platform or other kinds of platforms. And they have all sorts of ideas about what's going on in terms of information, processing information, what to believe, what not to believe. And I think a lot of that is part of other kinds of problems that we face, around the world. Because you have a whole series of groups who are fearful of all of that information, who didn't have access to all of that information in the past, which I think is part of what fuels various terrorist groups, is that they now have a lot of information that they didn't have before, and it's that information and change that creates all those anxieties and all of those tensions to try to survive, in some way.
Back to your question over here about what potential damage to the media may occur, or the functions that we're talking about. I guess I'm less worried about the standards and eventually it's all coming back into play. I'm more worried about the job that the media is doing right now. I'll give you one topic where I think they've done a really poor job. I mean, if you look at what Trump is doing, and you look about insecurity and narcissism and all that stuff, I mean, what he's been doing, and it's driven by to a great extent, is the negation of America's first black president. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is he's trying to negate everything about Barack Obama that he possibly can. I certainly didn't agree with Barack Obama on foreign policy and a variety of other such things. He's made some mistakes. Healthcare, basically taking that as the first item on the agenda, lost all his political capital to do other kinds of good things. But I think this effort to obliterate anything that Barack Obama has ever done, including repeal and replace Obamacare and all this other good stuff. I mean, Americans need health care. Repair and replace anything you want, but at least you got something on the table, let's do something with it. But with regard to this negation effort, the media has not done a very good job pointing it out. They feel it, they see it, but because of their own motivations, their need for economics, and have the economics that they need in order to survive and thrive, I mean, they forgot some very important stories, and that's only one among several other kinds of stories that they should be covering, but they're not doing it because of this constant interaction back and forth on other kinds of things. Some are real silly, like using the tweets for a story and all the rest that comes up on a regular basis. So there's some deficiencies here that need to be corrected, and maybe some of that stuff will be taught in the Columbia School of Journalism as it moves on down the road. I can't tell you for sure, but I would hope so, because it does needs to be brought out to the American people. It also needs to be brought out because by 2050, America's democracy is going to have to basically bring together a lot of different identities, whether they're Hispanics or whether they're blacks or whether they're refugees from Syria or from Bangladesh or whatever it may be. We need to be able to put that all together with regard to identity politics, and we're not doing a real great job about it right now because, all those old white guys that voted for Donald Trump, some are in this room, I'm sure. Not too many, because most of you are not old white guys. But in any case, they're not going to hold the steering wheel of democracy by 2050. And we need to make sure that our history is correct, not only with Barack Obama, but with a variety of other folks as well. So, other question. Let me ask you this. Where do you get your news? Where do you interact with the media? How many use Facebook? Really? I thought there'd be a lot more than that. Because 50%.
You only asked one question. You didn't ask about the other sources.
Go ahead.
Talk, just.
I kind of have a question about self-service.
I'll do that. Go ahead.
Since Trump does have the opportunity to talk directly through Twitter and stuff like that, do you think it helps him or harms him in the way, like, since he doesn't have to go through a media outlet and he doesn't have to I guess, thoroughly think about what he says, he can just directly type it and send it without giving much thought to it. Do you think him oversharing sometimes affects him worse than him directly talking to people? Because I know some people are like, oh, I like that he can directly talk to us, and makes it more personable. I like that he can do that. But at the same time, I think he can overshare, and that also affects him in a negative way.
Yeah, I think you're right. If you're asking me the question, does he overshare? Yes, he does. But he does that to appeal to the base to a great extent. There's not a lot of real intelligent stuff coming out of those tweets. You can only put so much in 140 characters, right? In addition, I'm suggesting here basically that using Twitter more selectively would be helpful in terms of his trying to add, you've heard me say in class that politics is all about addition. He hasn't been engaged very much in addition over the past 7 months, but using Twitter more selectively, using any social media more selectively, probably would get people to pay more attention, because folks now are just ignoring what comes out of the morning. Back to your point, there were only about 7 or 8 of you that said you use Facebook. Right now, according to the Gallup poll and the Pew Research Center and a variety of other places, 60% of Americans get their news from Facebook.
I do have a question on that. Do you mean like getting your news from like Facebook videos and like posts and stuff, or like
The news feed.
From the news feed, or like clicking on a link to an article that brings you to like a newspaper or
Right.
something like that?
Yeah, I mean, that's what
Either way?
Yeah,
Or-
either way.
Okay.
One of many sources.
What are some of the other ones? I mean, how many get from print media?
Online print, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, all that
Yeah,
stuff.
that confuses things. You're right. That's what I was getting to earlier in terms of, this fragmentation. Every major newspaper has to have something digital in order to go along with the print media. So when I say you get it from print media, I guess I'm really asking you still get it from the New York Times, but you may read it online is what it comes down to. Go ahead. Oh, okay.
Could you ask how many people get their stores from Fox News and how many get it from MSNBC?
How many get it from Fox? That's 11 out of this group. I don't know, what, maybe 35, maybe 30 people in here, 35 people. How many get it from MSNBC?
You do both?
Yeah, now MSNBC, some of you know this, that, I mean, Joe Scarborough was a Republican. He only became an independent in the last couple of months because he got so fed up. In fact, he was a pretty conservative Republican back in the 1990s. And Mika Brzezinski is a Democrat. So you get some kind of balance in there. How many get it from CNN?
Not anymore.
Wow.
That's,
Fake news, eh?
Communist news
Well, they
network.
have, like Jake Tapper specifically is somebody
Yeah.
that I like quite a bit. And he's seen of one of the pinnacles of news reporting at this current moment, with his shows and his print articles. And
Does a pretty
everything
good
on
job.
his site. Yes.
How many get it from Sunday Morning, Meet the Press, whatever, 1, 2, 4. That's interesting, because these are all face-to-face kinds of things, I mean, in fact, Jake Tapper and some other folks, even on Fox News, Chris Wallace, they were kind of fed up with Trump and all those politicians, Bernie Sanders and whatever, because they were phoning stuff in. And these are shows on Sunday morning that basically made their reputation with people coming in and talking to people face to face. And the politicians were basically saying, I don't have time, so I'll just call in. Eventually, Chris Wallace said, no, I'm not doing it anymore. And Tapper said, no, I'm not doing it anymore. And brought them back in again. But they were kind of getting a blended. Go ahead.
Just out of curiosity, anybody else listen to podcasts?
Now that's interesting.
But I got a question that kind of begs off of your question.
Okay.
And it has nothing to do with individually which way you lean. But everybody leans some way, even if it's straight up. But when you look at these individual sources, don't you already kind of have a known bias in the sense, well, maybe not a bias, but a knowledge of their bias, and that they're going to tweak their stuff a little bit one way or another already, and that either goes with or against you, and you're already kind of taking it with a grain of salt? I mean,
Yeah, I think people kind of adjust. But the world lives in an echo chamber. That sounds a little strange. But we all like to listen to what we like to listen to, right? So whatever our bias, we go in that direction. I'm sure you're listening to Fox News for a particular purpose. I'm sure you're listening to MSNBC for a particular purpose.
But sometimes when I listen to Fox, I go, that is a little crap. Same thing with
Yeah, I was gonna say
MSNBC.
the same thing. I want to listen to the other side, but, and I agree, MSNBC, Fox, they're both probably equally biased. And, you know, you're drawn to the one that matches your orientation. Part of you wants to watch the other side, but when you do, again, because they're so biased, and I'm sure Fox viewers that watch NBC feel the same way. It's just, you want to get both sides, but there's no.
I want this middle ground, and I don't
avenue
want
for
it
that.
shoved down my throat their way. I just want what it is, not
Well, I think
tweet.
objective and fair is boring. I mean, if we really
Truth is
did
truth.
get that, what would we watch or what would we read? I mean,
I told you it was a model that basically would hopefully appeal to more people, but I'm not sure. Yeah, let me catch you.
Like you talked about it, it's like economics. Like if there was a large demand for unbiased, straight to the facts reporting, then there'd be a lot more supply of it. But people like listening to things that are like giant headlines and play to one side.
And the corporate media world's already found that out.
And that's what sells. So that's what they do. If we didn't buy it, they wouldn't make it.
Right.
It's like paparazzi. They wouldn't take the paparazzi pictures. People wouldn't buy the magazines. You know?
I don't buy the magazine.
Well, I can appreciate that if you're looking at a platform that doesn't play to your ideology, like if I'm looking at the Gateway Pundit, right, there is a wall that's there that's I'm kind of more skeptical of what's on the Gateway Pundit than say the Atlantic or whatever. But I think what we risk is assuming that we can just kind of split the difference in, I'm going to watch Fox News for 15 minutes, I'm going to watch MSNBC, and then just kind of synthesize what they're giving us, because not all media outlets or print media is equal in the quality of the reporting, in the authenticity of what they're trying to do. I mean, you have obviously like on Breitbart, it's supporting a specific agenda, and there's people paying for that agenda. And I don't know if the same could be said with Jeff Bezos, the Washington Post, or Carlos Slim at the Times, if they're directing editorial, if they have the same editorial control that, say, Becca Moser has at Breitbart, or Steve Bannon has.
So there's kind of cross-cutting motivations, I guess, for Washington News. You're talking about quality to a great extent. Well, I think, Nathan, you'd have to be the last one, because I know people have to go to class and do other kinds of things, so. Okay.
What I would encourage is, rather than looking at, say, I need to be reading, equal amount of articles from both sides. I need to go to Fox and MSNBC. If you're really noticing, if it is really prominent, that kind of partisan bias, I would say curate that a little more based on the content, the quality of the content, kind of what Brian was saying here. And you can find things of quality that lean kind of to one side or another. If you're looking at daily news publications, the Wall Street Journal is a little more of a free market kind of right-wing publication as opposed to the New York Times, which leans a little more left. Both of them are fairly centrist, to be honest, but they are quality publications. If you're looking at monthly magazines and other kind of publications, Economist, a little more free market, pro-business, more to the right. The Atlantic, a little bit more to the left. And those are kind of what you want to be looking towards, a little more than, just seeing, well, what's the farthest to the right that I can find? Am I going to go on Breitbart? What's the farthest to the left that I can find? Am I going to go on Mother Jones or whatever you want to find over there? Look for the quality of the content itself. You can find quality writing that is partisan, that is leaning towards different ends of the political spectrum, but you want to look for that quality first and foremost, rather than something that immediately feeds into your own confirmation bias, your own desires for what you want to see. If I might be very liberal and I go to Fox News to read that, because the content is not as good, and that feeds into my idea that the other side is, not as good as mine. So you want to be aware of that when you are reading content.
And if you want to get educated, listen to what those two guys just said. I mean, because the echo will help you to a point, but the echo has its limitations to listen to. Thank you very much. Hopefully you have picked up a little bit of information to help you understand what Trump and the media are doing. If not, send us an email and Dan will answer it for you. Thank you.
Sounds like a true administrator.